Derek came to us from the University of Pittsburgh, and in 2017, got his master's degree, Georgia Tech in 2021, and is now working on finishing his Ph.D. His work focused on the flow characteristics of nacelle inlet that is operating in suction in the crossflow, and with emphasis on internal separation or mitigation of internal separation. And then, in my mind at least, slightly more importantly, the mitigation of ground vortices that we'll talk about in some detail. So Derek has done a real good job on his research project. He has 2 archival journal publications with at least 2, maybe 3 more to come. 1 patent, 7 conference papers. So he's been very productive, and perhaps just as importantly is pretty significant experience here in teaching. He was an ASME graduate teaching fellow and taught 3340, and is also a recipient of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. So with that,
thank you, Art. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Yeah, this is the culmination of 7 years of work here at Georgia Tech, and the thesis title is Characterization and Control of an Inlet Nacelle Flow in the Presence of Crosswind and Ground Effects, which is pretty wordy, but I promise you it's a very important situation because this is exactly an aircraft sitting on the runway getting ready for takeoff in a crosswind, right? So it's something we've almost all experienced at some point. And it's very important to study this condition because even though the aircraft will spend the majority of its time in cruise, it still has to be designed to perform well in these conditions, right? And so maybe some sacrifices have to be made. And what we really need to worry about are 3 different flow artifacts, but my research really focuses on 2, and these are inlet flow separation and a ground vortex. And so just a quick outline of this talk. First half is on purely inlet flow separation. Second half is on the ground vortex, and I'm going to be characterizing them in the first and then controlling them in the second. So without further ado, let's go into the first phase. This is the inlet flow separation. And so if we look at a cross section of this nacelle, it looks something like this. And what we need to worry about is in a crosswind, so this is just one area of this nacelle, but in a crosswind, this air will have enough streamwise momentum to deviate from the inlet surface, right? It looks something like this. This is called a separation bubble. And the separation bubble is bad, right? It causes a few different problems. You have decreased engine efficiency. You can have engine stall. You can have vortex jetting off the separation bubble. This can lead to blade vibrations, potentially damage, and it can produce noise, right? And so maybe unsurprisingly, we don't design airplane engines to separate. There's a federal regulation which sets a requirement on the performance in crosswinds. And so the way that manufacturers combat separation is that we make the engine lip thicker, right? A thicker engine lip gives the air more time to make this smooth turn into the inlet and then can delay the onset of the separation. But a consequence of having this thicker lip is that the engine size increases, its weight increases, the drag increases, and overall the efficiency decreases. And this takes up, causes problems in cruise where we need to have optimal performance. So what my research proposes to do is design some sort of flow control strategy such that we can use these thinner lipped engine nacelles, which use flow control to suppress the separation whenever it would be experienced. This experimental work is done at a facility at the Techway building here at Georgia Tech's NARA campus. There's a wind tunnel. This creates the crosswind speed in the test section. There's a separately controlled inlet. This operates in suction, mimicking an airplane engine, and it's in the center of the test section, right, shown here. And it's important to note that in this facility, we actually run at realistic speeds. So the crosswind is going to be what would be experienced on a runway, realistic crosswind speeds. And the flow through the inlet is also a realistic inlet speed. It's not scaled in any way from what you would experience in full scale. So really the 2 parameters that we can control in this experiment are the crosswind speed and the intake speed. It's also worth noting that this inlet is drooped. This is something standard on what you would see on commercial aircraft where it's longer up top than it is bottom. That's important when we look at results here in a second. So I said mass flow rate's important. This is synonymous with thrust in aircraft operations. And to measure this, we use an averaging pitot tube. This is between 2 flow strainer devices To use an averaging feeder tube, you have to verify that flow in that area is axisymmetric. This was verified by clocking a pitot tube at different radial and azimuthal positions. And you can see these all overlap. So the flow, for all intents and purposes, is axisymmetric, so it's okay to use this averaging feeder tube for experiments. But it is important to note that the flow does choke at some point. So we reach the speed of sound, the maximum mass flow rate through this inlet. And I'm going to use this choked mass flow rate to non-dimensionalize all mass flow rate. So if you see an m dot star, that's the mass flow rate in proportion to this maximum mass flow rate. A total pressure rake is used. This is used at the nominal location of the fan face to measure any losses or distortion that you would measure in an actual experiment or actual operation. There's a thicker density of probes at the wall to capture the growing boundary layer in experiments. And so this total pressure contour plot here would be what we experience with separation. So this red area here would be separation on the inside of the inlet. Finally, PIV is measured. This is particle image velocimetry. For anybody that's unaware, essentially you take two images very close together and correlate where particles moved, and you can get a velocity. And this experiment, this is done in the horizontal central plane on the windward side of the inlet. And so to capture the flow as it makes this turn into the inlet. Okay, so with all the diagnostic tools, let's see what it looks like here. First is characterizing in no crosswind, just to get a baseline for when a crosswind is introduced. There's three diagnostic techniques here. First is this total pressure contour plot. Here we can see no separation from what we saw in that previous slide. It's flow as you would expect. We have some losses at the wall, which are just from the boundary layer, but otherwise looks as you would expect. I'll point out though that we have more losses at the top than what we have at the bottom, because like I said, this is a drooped inlet. We would expect that there's a larger boundary layer at the top since it had more time to develop. The PIV on this windward side makes this smooth turn into the inlet. Any losses that we have, which are characterized by the vorticity, are at the wall just due to the boundary layer. And finally, surface oil flow visualization. To conduct this, you mix paint and oil. The oil is dragged along the surface, it kind of creates trenches in the paint, so you can see streaks, path lines, what the flow looks like at the surface. And here you can see axially aligned flow at the surface. So all in all, flow is behaving as you would expect in the absence of crosswind or separation. And then I can use this as a basis for comparison once this crosswind is introduced. So let's do that. We're going to look here at the effect of increasing intake speed for a fixed crosswind speed. This is synonymous with an aircraft sitting on the runway, getting ready for takeoff. It ramps up its engines in a crosswind. We can see what the development looks like at the wall. So here I'm highlighting a separated region. It's bounded by these two counter-rotating cells, which induce reversed flow at the wall, right? We can see reverse flow here. And off surface, we look at the contour plot, we can see that this extends pretty significantly into the flow, and it's skewed azimuthally downward, right? And once again, that's because this is a drooped inlet. If this was axisymmetric, we would expect that separation to be on the horizontal central plane, but it's located downwards a bit. If we increase our mass flow rate a bit more, this is to 94% of the maximum value. We can see that our main separation region has moved azimuthally upward. It's shrunken azimuthally, but we also have the formation of these smaller nodes at the base of the inlet here. Also, the radial penetration has decreased, but the losses in that bubble have increased. Finally, 98% of the choke mass flow rate. See that main separation region is now centered on the horizontal central plane. And one of these smaller regions at the base of the inlet is now bounded by a second counter-rotating cell. So kind of mimicking that main separated region. So we look at these as a whole. What we can see is, as we increase mass flow rate on the runway, our separation bubble will move azimuthally upward, shrinken in its azimuthal extent, and increase in complexity. If we look at the losses of the wall, they actually reduce radially, but increase in their magnitude of total pressure losses. On the other hand, we can also look at the effect of increasing crosswind speed for a fixed intake speed. This would be synonymous with an aircraft experiencing a gust on the runway where the local crosswind speed increases. I'll quickly just highlight here that 25 knots, there is a separated region, but it's not bounded by these characteristic circulation cells. 30 knots it is, and at 35 it grows azimuthally and moves azimuthally downward. So if we increase the crosswind speed, we would expect that separation to move azimuthally downward and increase in its azimuthal extent, and also increase in its radial penetration. So that was all good. That was fine. That took a lot of time to get those images. And that was really testing one combination each of intake speed and crosswind speed. And so if I wanted to get out of here in any reasonable amount of time, I had to devise some sort of experimental technique to test multiple combinations of intake speed and crosswind speed at a given time, right? And so what I used is this, I don't know what you want to call it, RPM sweep, where I ramp up the blower RPM to some maximum value such that I achieve a choked flow, so the maximum mass flow rate, and then ramp it back down. And so I'm doing up and down to test hysteresis, see if there's any effect of going up and back down, testing that effect. And this is the corresponding realized mass flow rate. So you can see it actually asymptotes eventually to the choked and then back down. And this is done at a slow enough rate of increase or decrease such that I essentially verify a quasi-steady variation of the inlet flow, and that's shown here. So if I pull one instantaneous value off of this mass flow rate sweep and look at this total pressure contour plot, you can see that if I compare it to values taken steadily at the fixed mass flow rate and crosswind speed, they look nearly identical, right? So between these two, it's safe to say that this experimental technique would allow me to test multiple combinations in one run. But I would have a lot of contour plots, right? How do I assign a numerical value to this contour plot to compare things? Well, there are two ways that we can do that in engine testing. One is called the total pressure recovery, which is a measure of the overall losses, and one is total pressure distortion, a measure of the heterogeneity. These are two very important concepts in engine design. So here we're going to measure this with a total pressure rate, where the fan face is nominally located. And here this is a demonstration of recovery. So with just a normal boundary layer, we expect pretty good recovery, close to 100%. But as the losses increase, we would see that those losses, or the recovery decreases, right? This is just a demonstration of this contour plot. But distortion, this is a measure of heterogeneity, or how uniform it is around the circumference. We can see these two are actually very nicely uniform around the circumference and therefore have low distortion, where this, with the separation on the windward side, is not located around the entire circumference and therefore induces high distortion by its definition, right? And the disadvantage of having something like this is you have uneven loading on the fan blades. This could lead to blade vibrations, a bunch of problems. That could lead to stall propagation. That's why you don't want distortion, right? And so my technique here is I set the crosswind speed to some fixed value. I ramp up my mass flow rate to the maximum value and then back down, and I can measure the losses and distortion at every instance in that mass flow rate sweep. So we see here for 0 to 10 knots that our losses essentially follow the same path. Same with the distortion. Don't really change much as we increase crosswind speed, and that's because the flow for those instances is not separated. But once we go to 15 knots, we can see we start off at a deficit here, maybe even a little more obvious in the distortion, and that's because we start off separated, right? Our flow separates at that low combination of mass flow rate, but quickly attaches maybe about 40% of the maximum flow rate. And we can see that this attachment is delayed further and further as we increase our crosswind speed, so 20 and 25, delayed further, until we get to 30 and 35, where we actually never truly attach and we're always separated, right? And we can see one nice thing, and I go into more detail in the thesis on this, but for the recovery, increased crosswind speed, we're almost always increasing recovery or decreasing recovery for a fixed mass flow rate. Whereas for distortion, if it's separated, it tends to follow one path, and if it's attached, it tends to follow another. So that's one thing. If you want more detail, feel free to read the thesis. So that characterized the flow. So I have an idea of when the flow is going to separate, what the impact is on the fan face, right? So now what can we do about it? Well, that's where flow control comes in. So the idea behind this flow control technique is that we're separating because the thickness of the nacelle in that location was inadequate, right? We have a thin lip, didn't have enough time to make that smooth turn into the inlet, and that's why we separated. And ideally, we use these thicker lips to prevent separation. So the idea behind this flow control technique is that we can artificially thicken the inlet lip using some sort of flow control, which leads to attachment when we need it. And then in cruise, we turn flow control off. We're able to use this thin lip nacelle design, which is optimized for cruise. One way that I tested this initially, I should say, is with something called aerodynamic bleed. The idea is you simply put a hole through the wall of the inlet, and because the outside is at a higher pressure than the inside, air will just naturally move through those holes with no need for any compressor or extra power. It'll naturally move, right? So this is one design that was used with larger holes, but also I used ones which were 25% smaller in diameter and area, which would look something like this, where we have smaller holes into the inside. And if we look here, so this is with the inlet taped, but this is where our separation would appear for 30 knots and 90% of our choke mass flow rate. So that typical separation that I'd shown earlier And so the idea is that in this area, the thickness of the lip was not thick enough, was inadequate, and that would produce separation. So ideally, we would apply flow control in that area to artificially thicken the nacelle lip and perhaps maybe lead to attached flow. And in reality, this looks something like this, where the majority of the inlet is taped on the outside, and I have these little tape dots to open or close different ports that I need to. So that's the configuration we're using. And we can see here for 25 and 30 knots, the recovery actually approaches a case which is very close to the uncontrolled base flow in the absence of any crosswind to begin with. If we look at the distortion, we are having an offset here by about 6%, but that's because we're applying flow control in only one area of the circumference, and we would expect that would induce a signature of distortion just by its definition. For 35 knots, we're not truly doing that well in terms of up to maybe 90% of choking, but our maximum flow rates, we actually are doing okay. I think this is a very nice demonstration of what's going on. Here in our base flow, we have this very large separation bubble. You can see it actually spans the whole way out to the total pressure rake there on the windward side. And if we use this triangular bleed configuration, it's gone, right? We have this small surface here, which you can see that's from the air coming in through the holes, but otherwise our flow is attached for all intents and purposes. In the corresponding PIV for those images, we can see this shear layer bounding the separated region in the base flow, and that shear layer is actually gone for the triangular thing. But there is a downside, right? This flow control method is tied to the speed of the inlet, right? If the inlet speed is not operating at a high mass flow rate, there's not going to be as much flow rate coming through those holes. And so we see that for all the conditions that I tested, I think I tested close to 50 flow control configurations for this, that we never do well down here, right, at low mass flow rates. So you can see going through some of them, this is the best we did, or I did, I should say, which is about 40% of the mass flow rate, of the choke flow rate. So I need to design some sort of technique or method to do well at low flow rates. And that's where active jet control comes in. This is independent of the speed of the inlet. We can pressurize an internal plenum to drive these jets. 3 jets were used. One steady device, this is a converging diverging nozzle, and there are 2 fluidic oscillators which are used. This is a demonstration by Sieber et al. Of a fluidic oscillator going back and forth. And the way these are powered is with an internal plenum, which is pressurized with air. So in practice, this would be air which is diverted from the engine, which is used for bleed air, and we can use it here in this application. The way that I can configure ports is different than the bleed. I actually have to go into this plenum, plug individual holes to set a configuration, close it back up. It took a bit of time to do this. At one point, Boeing was there timing me to see how quickly I could do this in the wind tunnel. But that's how we set the configuration. And similar to the bleed, this is our inlet. This is what the separation looks like on this inlet without it having any sort of control, highlighted here. And so this is where we want to apply flow control, right? This is where we are having a lip that's inadequate and having configuration look something like that, right? The difference of this is, compared to the bleed, is that I can choose what the strength is through those jets, right? I can set the CQ, which is the mass flow rate through all of the jets normalized by the maximum mass flow rate through the inlet. And I can configure this, right? I have some flexibility here, but generally we see that our IBC max decrease increases with CQ. So we're getting better performance as we increase this CQ. And so here, if we use this maximum CQ for all 3 of the devices, we can see that we're doing pretty well here at our maximum mass flow rates. And it's important to note that this flow control configuration was designed for the maximum mass flow rates. It was designed for this 90% choke value. But we don't do so well before that, right? We actually follow the base flow fairly closely. But this opens up this door of a dynamic control, right? So this flow control configuration, which was designed for the high mass flow rates, we would ideally have a different configuration chosen for the lower mass flow rates, right? So if we look here for 30, 60, and 90% of our choke flow rate, we can see initially our separation would be large, skewed azimutally downward. As we increase to a higher flow rate, it will start to recede from below, increase in its strength and complexity. And at that highest flow rate, we have a triangular configuration located on that windward side. This essentially shows that we need a control which is tailored towards the observed separation. And so what was done was that I probably tested close to 70 configurations, overlaid all of them, and found what the minimum envelope would be, right? So it essentially tells me what the optimum flow control configuration would look like at any given time. And if we want to look at this just for the optimal cases, so it's a little cleaner here, these are all the optimum cases that it turns out over overlapped on top of one another. If we highlight here, this would be the minimum envelope with the maximum possible distortion offset. And it will look something like this, where we would start off, we would activate our blue configuration. As the mass flow rate increases, we would change the orange configuration and so on and so forth, where we have control over what that separation would look like based on what the configuration is. And if we look, so this was our uncontrolled separation. And if we look at what configuration was actually optimal at each of these instances, it actually mimics what the separation looks like. This was done independently. It just so happens to confirm our theory of this virtual surface shaping, that it's skewed as we play downward, starts to recede from below, and then mimics the separation at that highest flow rate. And if we apply control, this is what our new oil flow looks like. So we see evidence of flow moving on the surface, and we have attached flow where we didn't before. And looking here, this is what the optimum recovery and distortion would look like, 30, 35 knots. If we look at the recovery, we're following the base flow in the absence of separation almost identically, right? So we are able to reduce almost all the total pressure losses with this flow control. As I said earlier, we do still have this distortion signature purely because we're applying flow control in one area, which is creating distortion by that definition. For 35 knots, we're doing better here. And this is something that we didn't see in the bleed. The bleed did okay at 35 knots. This is doing much better for 35 knots, and same with the distortion. And this is just something I'm throwing in here because I think it looks nice. If you look at what the turbulence is in the separation bubble in the base flow, it's almost completely gone in this flow control sense. So even though we do have a virtual surface which may be thicker, we're reducing the turbulence in that separation bubble, potentially leading to less vibrations on that family. So a summary of this work, this was looking at the flow separation and how to control it. I have shown that through optimized control, I can have the recovery approach that observed in the absence of any crossflow. I can decrease the distortion by 60% using optimized flow control. And this technology would allow for these thinner lipped nacelle designs optimized for cruise, which decrease the weight of the nacelle, increase efficiency, and potentially open the door for this hybrid electric aircraft as we transition to green energy sectors. So that was the first half of my work here. Second half is about the ground vortex, as I introduced earlier, shown here. And this recently, I would say, became a bigger problem in recent years. And it's because as we look through time at airplane engines, they've gotten bigger, right? And you might think that a bigger airplane engine is used because it generates more thrust, but that's actually not necessarily true. In fact, a bigger airplane engine is used because it's more efficient. And so if we look at what the impact of this is, we have an aircraft with big engines, we have good efficiency, which is nice in theory until we consider the presence of the ground. All right, so engines have gotten so large that they had to be flattened on the bottom for the Boeing 737 to prevent them from scraping during takeoff and landing. And an unforeseen consequence of having engines so large, so close to the ground, is that they form in the crosswind this ground vortex, which is shown here. Okay, and this is a problem, as you can imagine, because it, like a vacuum cleaner or something like that, ingests objects off the ground and causes damage, right? So the vortex can ingest rocks or tools, rainwater. One paper that I read said a moose was ingested into an engine, right? And so this causes damage, maybe unsurprisingly. 50% of all gas turbines which are removed from an aircraft for repair have been damaged in some way by foreign object ingestion on the runway, right? And this causes economic costs, right? So here we can see two broken fan blades. A fan blade costs on the order of $20,000 to repair. Here we see chips in the fan blade. This wouldn't be used, but imagine that the fan blade with chips in it was used. This would lead to fuel inefficiencies, right? But you also have things like unscheduled downtime, rescheduled flights, hotel accommodations associated with this ground vortex. And if you add all these costs together, it costs the airline industry roughly $3.8 billion a year, right? This is very important to understand the mechanism behind the formation of this vortex and leveraging that information, design some sort of flow control strategy to prevent it. The two main differences that were done or taken in this experiment. One is that the floor of the test section was replaced with a movable ground plane. So this can go from touching the base of the inlet to over, I think, 1.8 inlet diameters away. And so this is labeled H. That's a distance from the inlet center line. The other difference is that the drooped inlet that we had used in previous experiments is replaced with an axisymmetric inlet. And this is just to characterize the flow, right? Get a better idea of what's going on without any impact of this droop. One other thing is that the mass flow rate that I use, I'm now going to use something called P dot. This is dimensionless, or no, this is the thrust of the inlet. This is, as you'll see, more characteristic of what's going on, but it's still just measured based on the mass. The only change to diagnostic techniques is that in PIV, we're now taking PIV parallel to the ground plane. This is to observe the vortex as it moves on the ground, see what its domain of influence is, get an idea of where it's moving, what it can pick up. And then we also do PIV parallel to the inlet plane. This is to observe the vortex as it moves within the inlet, see if it makes it into the inlet. And stereo PIV is also taken at slices moving away from the inlet face. So if we first look at what conditions lead to the onset of this ground vortex, we see here, if we increase the crosswind speed, what is the corresponding thrust and ground plane distance for the ground vortex to first begin to form? We see a very nice relationship here where we see that the thrust has to increase consistently as the crosswind speed increases. And something we love to do in fluid mechanics is form dimensionless groups. And I know in fluids class, you might not understand why we use Buckingham pi theorem. But if we do something where we scale this thrust by the corresponding momentum flux at the crosswind speed, we can see that all of these curves happen to collapse on a given curve, right? Where it's represented here, where if we know the h over d, which we will know for a fixed engine, right? The h over d does not change until you take off. We would know what is the critical inlet momentum flux for which a ground vortex will first form, right? So with this equation, we can predict when will a vortex form, right? Where anything above this curve is a case where a vortex would be there. Anything below, there's no vortex. So why do these curves collapse? What's actually going on fundamentally to create this scaling? Well, if we pick a condition here, this is at 200 for this P dot star, we can see that two corresponding flow fields, which can be formed with different combinations of the crosswind speed and intake speed. So here, this is a 5-knot crosswind, 22% of the maximum mass flow rate, so relatively low. Up here, or down here, we have 20-knot crosswind and 92% of our maximum mass flow rate. And we see that through these vectors here, these are all equal length, but they'll prove a point, that both of these flow fields look nearly identical, right? And maybe a better way of looking at this situation is through these lines. These lines are tangent to the in-plane velocity field. So these aren't stream lines, but they're tangent to the in-plane velocity field. And you can see that they're nearly identical, even though one of them has speeds which are over 4 times higher than what we would see in the lower speed case, right? And so why are these curves collapsing? Well, they're collapsing because the flow field is in fact scaling, and it's scaling by this crosswind speed. Not only does the external flow field scale, but the vortex, which is embedded in that flow field, also scales. So here, once again, we're looking at this 200 for P dot star. We can form it multiple different ways, as you can see here. And we look at this break at the base of the inlet. This is measuring the effect of the ground vortex within the inlet. We can see that if we scale these pressures by the dynamic pressure of the crosswind speed, that all of these curves collapse onto this given curve, right? So this vortex, its external flow field is scaling. The pressure signature of the vortex is scaling with the dynamic pressure of the crosswind, but the internal flow field is not scaling, because here we can see separation for this case at 20 knots, even more apparent here. So the separation does not scale with the dynamic pressure. And this further is ingraining the fact that the internal flow field is really independent of what's going on. It's really the external flow field which is creating this change, or this vortex. Okay, so I showed one plane. Oh, yeah. Also, I want to indicate this. This is kind of interesting. So here we can see that this dynamic pressure, or scaling with the dynamic pressure, and we look at corresponding instantaneous images, we can see that the core of this vortex is just becoming brighter and brighter. And that's because more of that core is reaching the dew point, more of it's condensing. And so even though the vortex is in the same location, has a lower pressure, and that's even seen just through the condensation of that vortex core. Okay, so I showed that one plane is scaling. But I argue that the whole flow field needs to be considered whenever we want to think about this ground vortex. So how we know when it forms, but why and how is it forming, right? So let's consider here. This is the inlet operating at a low momentum flux. We can see that there's really no ingestion near the ground plane. This is all moving from left to right. And if we start to increase our mass flow rate, we're going to see what's going on, hopefully, to produce this change and create the ground vortex. So here we go. We're increasing mass flow rate. We can see this dramatic change in the flow field. And I'm going to pause this in a second here. So we see now we have a vortex formed. This is characterized by its out-of-plane vorticity concentration. So this vortex forms. We have flow wrapping around the top of the inlet, moving along the ground plane, being ingested along the lower side. Right. This is creating this huge change in this flow field. And we look at a case right before the vortex forms. So there's no vortex. There's no signature of this vorticity within the inlet. But if we look around the ground plane, we see this reversed flow start to initiate, right? And I argue, and I'm about to show, that this reverse flow is fundamental for the formation of this ground vortex and actually a precursor for it forming. So let's look at this this plane here, but we're instead now looking at the ground. So we were just looking at the face. Let's look at the ground at this plane just outside of the inlet face here. So here's that reverse flow that we just saw that's moving from right to left. And that's actually flow which is becoming ingested into the inlet. But further away from the face, we have flow moving from left to right. This is just the crosswind moving within the wind tunnel. We can even see that the magnitude of that velocity is 1, as we would expect. That's the crosswind. And between these two, we have an area of 0 velocity. And this creates a shear layer, a countercurrent shear layer, which we can highlight here. And we see that in this movie, we have vortices forming in this shear layer, moving downstream. And every once in a while, we'll have the vortex formed, move upstream, and that becomes a fully formed ingested ground vortex. So these vortices are forming just due to a Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. And we can mark the location of every instance where a vortex forms, and they all bound this countercurrent shear layer. And if we slightly increase that P dot star, that shear layer will move a little further from the inlet face, but still the vortices are forming around that shear layer. So what's the difference between these vortices? I showed a video of a vortex which just sheds downstream and one that moves upstream and is ingested. Let's look a little more detail about what is the difference between these two. So here's a streamwise advected vortex. That's a vortex that just sheds downstream, right? So there it goes. Nothing too interesting to look at yet. But now let's look at an upstream advected vortex. It's one that becomes ingested. So it hangs out there, goes upstream. The main difference, as you can probably see between these two vortices, is that one strengthens significantly and it's out of plane vorticity, right? Where one just remains at relatively low levels, one strengthens and becomes ingested, right? So it must be that this vorticity has some effect on the ingestion or formation of this ground vortex. Where we look and follow these paths over time, we see that one sharply rises in that vorticity, where one remains relatively low, right? This was done at one plane. And if I want to find out really what's going on with this flow, I need to have an idea of what the vorticity looks like in the whole domain, right? So this opened up this idea of using the stereo PIV and slices, very fine slicing between the planes. I think I was close to 50 planes reconstructed to form this flow field, where with a 3D grid of 3D data, I could reconstruct this flow field. So here I have a case where I'll seed particles from near the ground plane just to initiate the seeding and watch where they go through this experimental data. If I take a condition below this curve, we can see that no flow from near the ground is ingested into this inlet, right? It maybe has a slight updraft, but none of that's ingested. If we move to a case which is on or maybe just slightly above this curve, we're starting to ingest flow from near the ground, but there's no vortex yet. But you can't really see in this realization, there's a shear layer which forms right here. That shear layer, which is initiating these vortices, is actually forming right back here. So we're starting to form the vortex, and that's why we're on or slightly above this curve. But if we move more significantly, where we're above the curve, we form a vortex, and that vortex will continue to progress as we continue to increase that mass flow rate, right? And so we can do more with this. This can make nice pictures, but it's a little more useful to get data out of this. And so I reconstructed what the vortex center line looked like. This is in more detail in the thesis, but essentially I can find with the gamma 1 criteria what the center of each vortex looks like at each plane and fit a polynomial through them to get what the center line of each vortex looks like. And I can find the variation of various parameters along that center line. So looking first at the vortex radius, we see that as the vortex moves into the inlet, that the radius decreases. That's because this vortex is stretching as it makes its way into the inlet. The vortex flow rate increases because we're entraining flow from the surroundings as this vortex moves into the inlet. And most importantly, the circulation is constant along that center line, right? This means that the vorticity has to come from one source. Where is it coming from? Some people argue that the vorticity comes off the surface of the inlet. Some say ambient vorticity from the air. But shown here using this 3D data, I was able to reconstruct what the vorticity field looks like, where this level down here is the boundary layer vorticity. So it's the sum of the two components in the ground boundary layer. We can see that this boundary layer vorticity is siphoned off of the ground plane and feeds this main component of vorticity. This is the vorticity along the vortex center line. So the vortex is sustained by vorticity out of this ground boundary layer, as you can see here. Okay, so we know it's coming from the ground, but where exactly is this flow coming from? As what this demonstration shows here, where I can label particles based on where they end up, right? So here, orange particles are going directly into the inlet. Blue are particles where we can't definitively say where they're going because they're going to go out of frame, but yellow are particles which seed the core of the vortex. So let's follow those in time. And we can see here that this vortex is being seeded entirely from flow behind and underneath the inlet, right? And so if we want to design some sort of flow control strategy to prevent the formation of this vortex, we should prioritize or prevent the flow from underneath and behind that inlet. That's how we should design this flow control strategy. And I tested many ways of doing this. Control the formation of the vortex. I tested a few different ways of suppressing this vortex, and it turned out that the best performance we got was from repurposing this bleed inlet. And you might wonder why. Before we were controlling the internal flow field with these holes, but these holes actually also are affecting the external flow field, right? Air is moving into these holes from the outside and controlling or changing what this external flow field looks like. Where once again, air will naturally move through those holes just based on the pre-existing pressure gradient. So this is going to change how the inlet ingests flow. So before, all of the flow had to come from the face, right? Now we can decrease the volume flow rate through the face because we can make up for it with volume flow rate through each of these holes. But if we want to prioritize the ingestion of flow away from the ground plane even further, a configuration like this is chosen, where we have the upper half, prioritizing that flow from above the inlet and away from the ground plane. Let's look at these three inlets. Taking a case which forms a vortex in the base flow, if we use these same exact conditions for the base flow, we see that for the control cases, no vortex is formed. Right here, for this case, we actually do have the formation of the shear layer, so a vortex is about to form in this condition. Where this condition here, no shear layer, we're starting to ingest flow from near the ground, but we're still delaying it even further there. And if we look at the corresponding formation maps for these three cases, we can see why there's no vortex. And that's because this condition here is away from these formation lines. The formation line for this case here with the top open was able to be offset from the previous case by over 300%, right? So we can use mass flow rates or thrusts of 3 times higher before a vortex will ultimately form. But vortex can still eventually form, right? We can still have conditions where a vortex forms for all 3 cases. Let's look at those 3. So here's a vortex, each of 3 cases, but even though it's there, it's weaker. So we can characterize this vortex, once again, find its center line, find the variation of certain parameters along that center line. And here, if we look at the circulation along the vortex center line, it's decreased by about 60% from the previous uncontrolled vortex. So that means this vortex is incapable of picking up as heavy of objects, won't do as much damage, potentially won't move around as much, and overall, we're able to control this vortex even when it forms. So a summary of this phase of the work. The vortex initiation is governed by a quadratic relationship between the thrust and the ground plane distance. This ground vortex forms in the flow field only after increasing in circulation through the ingestion of vorticity out of this ground boundary layer. Vortex can be delayed to over 3 times higher thrust values using this peripheral bleed actuation. And the advantage of this is that this control could prevent foreign object ingestion on the runway, which, as I said, cost the airline industry about $3.8 billion a year. For the work as a whole, what are the impacts and insights? First, the phase of characterizing inlet flow separation. I was able to find through any combination of intake speed and crosswind speed when separation would occur. I was able to characterize that, finding where and when the thickness of that lip was insufficient. Utilizing this information, I designed a few different flow control strategies to prevent separation using this virtual surface technique, where the optimal flow control strategy resembles what the separation looks like. I've shown that there's a new mechanism for the ground vortex formation and sustainment. This forms following the initiation of this countercurrent shear layer on the ground. And once formed, the vortex is siphoning this boundary layer vorticity to lead in its sustainment. And I've shown a novel method for the delay of the suppression or delay of the ground vortex using this peripheral bleed actuation, which changes the flow field externally, prioritizing flow from above and away from the ground plane. So just some acknowledgements I want to throw out here. Thank you to my advisor, Ari, who I came to Georgia Tech with no advisor and no experimental fluid mechanics technique to speak of. Ari gave me a chance here, and I hope This was okay research. Thank you to Boyan, who, was a second advisor, I would say, to me, and always I would look forward to him coming down the hallway. I'd always hear his door close, and I know he'd be coming. Thank you to the rest of my committee and the rest of the lab. Slava, especially all members, past, present, future. Thank you, Gabrielle, for always being there for me. Funding sources, Boeing funded the first 2 years of this research. We've gone to NSF and Georgia Tech. Actually graciously funded this project for, I don't know, past 2 or 3 years. The mental health committee has been pivotal for my time here at Georgia Tech. And thank you to Glenda, Regina, Angela, Carrie in the back, Bruce and Daryl, always helping out around Georgia Tech. It's been very useful. And finally, thank you to everybody here. My family probably doesn't understand why I went to grad school whenever I could have just gone out of undergrad. It's been a long journey. Thank you to my cat. He's been a huge help for me. My fiance, Cindy, stuck with me even though this was a long journey, and her family for helping to provide the food. It's very helpful for being my family away from home. And thank you to my family who, I already said that. Well, yeah, thank you to everybody.
All right. So floor is open for questions from the general audience. And any questions? Go ahead.
I got 2 questions. So your initial testing for the flow control, you measured total pressure at where the fan surface would be.
Yeah.
I think for your actual setup, you didn't actually have a fan there.
No.
Rotating.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that my first journal submission did not like that we didn't have a fan. So there's no fan there, where the fan face would be. And so we're measuring what the effect would be at the fan face if there was a fan. But the fan actually changes the separation a little bit. But what we've shown is that if you know what your separation looks like, by applying flow control in that area, you're so able to suppress the separation. And so even though this separation might look different if there is a fan, the idea still holds that you can control that separation using these techniques. Yeah.
And then my second question following from was, so you presented 2 different mechanisms you were looking at, or related into Crosswind, but Vortex around ingestion, and then also control of the separation bubble.
Yeah.
And does your schemes that you came up with compete with each other?
Well, so no, actually, yeah, the because that can be used for both. So this was repurposed. This was originally meant for separation control. And so whenever I've used this inlet for testing, I actually did not observe separation. So that there is no separation because it's doing its job in suppressing the separation that would have formed originally. I would say probably more optimization would have to take place to make sure that you can reduce the distortion effect that you're getting from this and doing something like that, but it can be used for both. Yeah. Tom, you had a question?
I was actually going to ask the same thing. How do the two, if you want to deal with crossflow and ground vortex, how do the 2 strategies interact with each other?
Right. Yep. So it's able to do both. I think more optimization would need to be done to do both effectively at the same time, but yeah.
Georgia Tech has a patent application on that, of course. Any other questions? Must have done a real good job. All right, so with that, the general audience is excused. Pick up whatever leftovers there.